congratulate this initiative of the two societies to put this event together. I think it's very timely given the context. I was just talking to my neighbor on the left, and you just confirmed that the government just got formed in Libya an hour ago, so we have a lot to talk about EU's role as well. Just to briefly give an overview of the context and to what extent Europe is changing Libya and how Libya is changing Europe before giving the floor to the speakers. The EU has had a series of initiatives to actually deal with its Mediterranean neighborhood. We had the Barcelona Declaration, the European Neighborhood Policy, the Union for the Mediterranean, also so that Libya is actually joining now, or soon to be potentially this Union for the Mediterranean. But actually over the last decade, the EU has mostly had normative commitments to the region, such as democratization, promotion of rule of law, but we would say that mostly it has focused on its internal security concerns, such as migration and also counterterrorism. So the Arab Revolution is really shaping, I think, EU foreign policy. It's an awakening, a big test case for the future of common foreign and security policy. New players are on the ground as well from a geopolitical perspective. You have also to take into account the role of Turkey, the Gulf countries, in shaping what is happening, or the role also of the Arab League. So is the EU fit for what is going to happen, and is Libya actually willing also to have EU on board and to support the transition towards democracy? That's the debate of tonight, and I will give 5 minutes to each of the speakers to actually give them their vision on that question. And I would like to start by Mr. Gheblawi.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. Let me start first by just giving a general perspective on how was the relationship between Libya and the EU before the revolution. Basically, the Gaddafi regime made the relationship with Europe only on matters of economy, basically oil and gas, and also counterterrorism. Before rehabilitating Gaddafi in 2003 and before lifting the sanctions in 1999, the European relationship was, I think, more fragmented. There wasn't a front towards dealing with Gaddafi because the regime, there was only some of the countries, especially like Italy, had a special relationship with Libya because of the colonial history. But this relationship continued, and Gaddafi, and at that time the regime exploited that relationship and made lots of deals outside the European Union, and also outside the sanctions that have been made against him to rehabilitate, to open up and make the changes in policy. After 1999 and 2003, the regime changed tactics and began engaging more in Europe and putting pressure basically on two fronts: the economy, the oil, and the second one is terrorism, and the third one also on immigration and illegal migrants. Gaddafi used those tools to push towards that European Union be neutralized in doing more towards changing the political landscape of Libya, or addressing problems in human rights, addressing problems in reform. And in 2006, when his son, Saif al-Islam, started what was called at that time a reform program that was only about a facelift for the regime and giving it more breath and giving it more life, the regime started to engage more on different levels of Europe. They tried as much to approach it towards the countries as they did before. They didn't approach it into one European Union They approached, for example, they had a special relationship with Spain, with the previous, I think, conservative government, and also they had a special relationship with Mr. Berlusconi in Italy, and that relationship continued even after 2008, and with the signing of an agreement for compensation during the colonial time to Libya, and Gaddafi made that as political bargaining chip. Also, in many ways, also made him. He tried as much as possible to his popularity inside Libya. After 2000, in 2011, I think what happened is that there is a complete shift now towards a new relationship with the European Union, especially now that the engagement should be different. In my opinion, Libyans are looking forward to a better balanced, I think, and also committed to the European Union in Libya, more than committing with, for example, other powers like the United States or China or Russia. Although the economy, and especially oil and gas, will stay as the main motive and also the main driving force towards these kind of things. But at the same time, I think now, given that the political landscape has changed, there is a good opportunity and the stakes are high that the European Union can engage more towards democratization, towards better human rights, and towards better understanding of the region first, and secondly with the problems of Libya, especially now. There is plenty of work to be done where the new government has been instated, and we need more, I think, cooperation towards also the matter of illegal migration to Libya. And now I think the new government should address that in more active way, although there is plenty of other problems they need to address. But I think the first matter is dealing with the new government, dealing with Libya as an example that should be based on not only the economy but also on politics and also on human rights level, on migration, and also, if it is possible, in terrorism, because of the problems that has been inherited from the Gaddafi regime. I think that concludes my.
Yes, thank you very much. And I will turn now to two experts, or rather the European Union side. I forgot to mention that we have this panel discussion, and of course afterwards, later on, we will have Q&A also, where you can ask questions. So, Dr. Berenskoetter, would you like to react on how this Libyan event has changed the European Union?
Yeah, thank you very much. I briefly would like to say one or two words on how Europe is changing Libya. So the first part of the question, and I only want to say here, and I'm not an expert on that, but I think there is basically a history that has to be seen as one of attempting to bring change. At least that was the rhetoric, and there were some policy initiatives in that direction. But I think that actually has been trumped by quite clear interest by member states that ended up of pursuing a policy of stability. And I think that is important because there was a fundamental tension over the past 10, 20 years between the rhetoric of trying to bring change and the actual policy pursuit that was more in the interest of stability and an arrangement with the authoritarian regimes in that region. I guess we can talk more about that later, but I think it is important to keep that tension and that paradox and contradiction, and for Europe also a bit embarrassing state of affairs in mind. Now obviously Europe then had this I think quite a significant role in speeding up and bringing about the downfall of the Gaddafi regime in participating for NATO. So that was a change phase that happened rather quickly. Now, the more interesting question that I want to address here is, not more interesting, but the one I know more about, is how Libya is changing Europe. Libya meaning how does this event, how did the intervention affect Europe? And I think there are two basic issues here. The first is how does it affect European foreign policy? for, in particular, its security and defense policy? And the second is how does it affect NATO and EU-American relations? I will just say a few words on the first and maybe one or 2 points on the left if I have time. Let me first say that the reaction in the media and until today is still one that is very familiar to observers of EU foreign policy, namely one that says, well, what the EU did was basically nothing, it was a failure. The EU lacks, as we all know, unity, and it is ineffective when it really comes down to addressing the issues and reacting to crises. And despite these institutional advancements through the Lisbon Treaty, its security and defense policies remains a paper tiger. It is dead in the water, and its attempt to launch such a mission called EUFOR Libya is considered to be an April Fool's joke because it was agreed on the 1st of April. It never happened, that mission. So there is the sense of that the EU once again failed, and we have heard this again and again, and the reasons are also straightforward. The first reason is that there is just a capability expectations gap, meaning that the EU simply cannot deliver or act in line with its rhetoric as a global player simply because it lacks the resources. And the second reason is that there is a lack of political will simply among member states to act as a collective. So it's, that this unity is the reason the High Representative is just not strong enough. And we have seen both, well, some put the blame on the person of the High Representative that is now, she's a woman and she's not forceful enough to make a stand, supposedly. And others have said, well, it's just an institutional problem. And because she doesn't have any real power. And then there is the Hungarian presidency, of course, that was leading the EU at the time, which, so it was said, was ill-equipped and lacked experience dealing with this. So in the end, all the nice EU institutions didn't really deliver. It was just that disunity among member states that prevented any reasonable action. Now, this is kind of the picture that we're given. Yeah? And I want to just make 3 points here, 3 observations. The first is that this complaint is an evergreen. We have seen this after the first Iraq War, or technically the second Gulf War in '91. We've seen this after Bosnia, we've seen this after Kosovo, which in the end still ended up being catalysts for advancing integration in security and defense affairs and led to renewed efforts to strengthen common security and defense policies, and I think the same will happen this time. Secondly, the question, was it really a failure? Not quite. The European response wasn't really a failure for various reasons. First, the EU was not inactive. It supported sanctions, it supported an arms blockade, it put in place the freezing of financial assets, put in place a travel ban, issued $30 million of euros of humanitarian aid, and so forth. So it did something. It would be wrong to say that the EU was inactive. Second, many point out now, well, actually, Europeans have taken the lead even in the military operation. Yes, they did that through NATO, but still, this is celebrated by many who support a stronger European role in military issues as a success, because it shows that Europeans can do something. They do have military assets that can pull off such an operation, although it's clear that NATO still was relying heavily on US assets, and the US played a very important role at the beginning of the operation. Furthermore, I would argue that, or this is observation, this unity among Europeans is not so straightforward. Some simply did not want to participate, such as Germany, and I can talk more about that later on, but they were not against the intervention. They simply did not want to participate. There's something in the EU, CFSP now called constructive abstention. That means we're not against it, but we're simply not part of it, but we're happy if you go ahead with whatever you want to do. And so I think many European states were actually quite happy to let the UK and France hop forward and be quite active, for whatever reasons, Sarkozy and the Cameron government being very active and rather aggressively pushing their agenda for military intervention. I would also say that states like Germany actually felt more comfortable to have NATO take the lead simply because they would prefer to have the European security and defense policy to keep its identity as a civilian power rather than as a new NATO or as a second NATO and a military power. So I think this is important to keep in mind. All of these issues, they don't quite make this assessment or evaluation of the EU or the EU response as a failure as clear-cut as it is often made. Now, I have only 1 minute left, so let me say 2 points on the effect on NATO, EU or EU-US relations. First is that while there has been a talk that this might now be a new model for intervention, meaning that, as already practiced in Iraq and Afghanistan, heavily relying on air campaigns and bombing, and let the fighting on the ground be done not only but primarily by locals, which means that there are fewer casualties for the West, for NATO members. Now, this again is out there, this argument that this is a new way to intervene, but I think what this forgets is that there is still the responsibility for post-conflict reconstruction, because once you get involved, once you are participating in bombing, you are responsible for helping to rebuild. And the second point, and then I'll conclude, is basically this view that Libya was a success to NATO, helping it to new relevance after Afghanistan. Is a bit short-sighted as well, I would say, let's put it that way. It's because yes, the UK would like to see that, the UK government. France is actually less eager to bring new life to NATO, but in the end, it's the US role in NATO is diminishing, simply because the US is less interested in being committed to NATO and takes a much more pragmatic approach to kind of a coalition of the willing. So I actually think that NATO, through this Libya operation, is far from getting a new shiny armor and a new shiny mission. I actually think that in the long term, what we will see is that the EU will continue to build its institutions more than NATO.
Thank you very much. Maybe Anthony Dworkin, do you want to comment also on how Europe has been changed, maybe how it impacts also Libya? I just note that you have written this policy brief, if you're interested, and you focus on a new vision for democracy and human rights for the European Union. So you have 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I've been working with this think tank, European Council on Foreign Relations, on Europe's response to the Arab revolutions. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the broader context. How has Europe responded to the Arab revolutions, and Libya is a case study of that, and how much can they influence the course of developments in the future. And just to give you a kind of headline response to these questions, how much have the Arab revolutions changed European foreign policy towards the southern Mediterranean? Not as much as you might think, is my answer. I think this is a historic opportunity. It's a series of absolutely dramatic and historic events. It's easy to say things are historic, but I think these really are. And I think the danger is that Europe is kind of saying that they recognize the importance, but perhaps not really taking it on board enough. How much could Europe change what's happening there? Well, if Europe is not changing as much as we might hope, I think similarly its ability to influence what's happening is also perhaps not as great. So they're not doing enough, but they should recognize the limits of what they can do. In other words, there's a kind of middle ground where I think Europe should define its policy, doing more than they're doing now, but recognizing the limits on what they can do. And to set out why, I think we have to look at the nature of the broader context in which these revolutions take place, what the revolutions are trying to achieve, and so on. How much has Europe changed? Well, as you said, essentially European policy in the last decades towards the southern Mediterranean talked a lot about democracy and human rights and did very little. And the reason that it did very little was that it didn't, on the whole, European countries didn't see a way of combining their short-term interests, which represent a variety of different, quite important things. We shouldn't deny the importance of these things, and after all, some European countries are not very far from North Africa. And they didn't see a way of combining these short-term interests with longer-term leverage on political reform. So it was a kind of passive policy. I think they didn't recognize how much the societies were changing, and they could do business with the regimes, and they didn't really see a way to pressure the regimes while at the same time doing business with them. But now we see a very transformed context, and the context is that again, as you said, the idea was stability and reform are intention. But actually, if you look at the region now, you see something which is almost the opposite of that. Stability seems to be dependent on reform, and those countries which are refusing to reform, and above all, which are refusing to acknowledge the popular aspirations for a greater popular involvement in the government and the direction of their country, and a greater respect for the dignity of the population, and a greater respect for the idea of social justice, cannot provide stability, it now appears. And therefore, the challenge is to develop a policy which is going to do more to promote reform, because in the end that also is the best way to guarantee stability. But the question arises, how much can Europe influence? And I think while there is now a desire to do what the EU can in these contexts, there also is a real limitation on what the EU is willing to offer. And I think, unfortunately, the European response is characterized still by a kind of defensiveness. And I think you see the defensiveness as soon as you get onto questions like migration, where the kind of very hopeful revolution in Tunisia, which even now looks like the one big success story of the so-called Arab Spring, with the elections which were really terrifically well conducted, and the unity government coming out of them. Even so, all it took was a few thousand refugees arriving in the Italian island of Lampedusa, and we saw a response which was dominated by fear of immigrants coming into Europe, and the whole Schengen system of border free movement across Europe appeared to be shaking. A kind of relatively small number, given that hundreds of thousands of refugees from Libya were actually washing over the borders into Tunisia and Egypt, and were welcomed and met with a very positive response. The European response was very limited. And similarly, the other thing that I think that Europe could offer that would make a big difference is freeing up agricultural trade, because those of you who went to the discussion of the European economic crisis yesterday will have realized Europe isn't in a position at the moment to offer a lot of money. But what they can offer is access to markets. And again, this is something that's going to require a degree of sacrifice from some European member states, who after all will face more competition for agricultural produce if they do this. And so that commitment isn't there yet. So I think at the moment what you see from Europe is a desire to help, but to help in a way that's a kind of arm's length. They don't really want a kind of a deeper relationship between the societies of North Africa and European societies. And ultimately, I think that's the way that you're most likely to have a really transformative effect is through these kind of deeper social links. I think the kinds of things that people are talking about in Europe now are more to do with the kind of European neighborhood policy and kind of long-term integration, working towards free trade agreements in the future and so on. But first of all, it's not clear that these offers are credible. And secondly, I think this model of essentially expecting the countries of North Africa to sort of move towards the European model is also a little bit irrelevant. And I think the key to, and this is why I think Europe has to recognize the limits on its influence. These were revolutions that were driven by a desire for self-determination. These were dignity revolutions. The people of these countries wanted to seize control of their countries for themselves. And what they don't really want is for the European Union to say, fine, now that you're moving towards democracy, come and look at us and we'll tell you how to do it. I think what's needed is, instead of the old European approach, which worked after 1989, of kind of holding the European model up as the way to do it and as the kind of pole of attraction, which worked in the context of Eastern Europe because they wanted to join the European Union. They were rejoining Europe, but that's not what's happening in the context of North Africa. And so I think the challenge is to have a vision of democracy and human rights that responds more to the local context, and where Europe is in a more of a supporting role rather than a kind of tutorial role, which is going to be a challenge. And I think the challenge is going to be in prioritizing a kind of genuinely fair and inclusive politics in these countries, but at the same time putting up with the fact that this is going to throw up some results with which Europeans may be a little bit uncomfortable. We've seen an Islamic Party come out on top in the elections in Tunisia, which was the most secular country in North Africa. We've seen, kind of some stirrings of disquiet in Europe about statements coming out of Libya about the return of Sharia law. In Egypt, which I'll be happy to talk about more, it's not really our subject tonight, we see a very confusing situation where I think Europe is probably not reacting as strongly as it could, again, because of fear of the Muslim Brotherhood taking power. So, I think in Libya, what the EU can offer is going to be assistance on, helping to focus on a few key priorities, which is building a fair political system and building proper institutions, and having to accept that, that the way that the Libyans kind of choose to run those things is really a matter, first of all, for the country itself.
Thank you very much. So we clearly see that, indeed, following the different interventions, the EU, let's say, past policies are somehow outdated with what we are facing at the moment in North Africa. And I wanted to turn to you again, and really because you told me you were in Libya in October, can you maybe elaborate more? I mean, if you would have to advise Catherine Ashton on what to do and maybe to deepen those structural links, to choose a few priorities, what would those be? You have mentioned migration and counterterrorism. We know that actually the EU is quite good at actually working on those issues, but on democratization, what would be your advice?
I think I agree that the role that the European Union should play is a support role in Libya. And that's putting in mind that there is in the new government, I think even some of the figures, the political figures that are coming up in Libya, a lot of them are either opposition figures or people who've been living in Europe for a long time, and that might also have an impact on the future of Libya. But the other thing I think is that they should understand the priorities. Number one is that Libya hasn't had any political reform since, I think, even 1951, since independence. So there was only one election that has been rigged at the time, and then after that there wasn't any political life in Libya, even during the monarchy. So for 60 years you're facing with a society that didn't have any political debate, no political or democratic culture. And that, I think, is a huge step towards changing the atmosphere. First of all, I think what we lack in Libya basically is training and experience. Libyans are eager to learn a lot, and especially if there is now a second generation of Libyans who were living in Europe, living even in America and Canada. They are going back to Libya and more or less forming a new kind of change in the country, because the country is very young. About 60% of the population is below the age of 40, and most of these will be the driving force for the future. And what we need is, I think, that NGOs or even institutions that with the European Union to help spreading the culture of democratization in Libya, and also political process in Libya. That is very important. Now, if you go when you go to Libya now, and people are very happy, they have energy that is quite contagious. I mean, if you go there, just feel that you need to smile all the time. And but that will abate after a while, because the people there will see that there is plenty of challenges. And but when you start to, for example, I had a conversation with somebody where I was attending a a meeting with a new political party that is forming in Libya. And the word party itself, Libya, has been incriminated for about 40 years. If you say party, you're either going to be ended in jail or being killed. That for 40 years. So that was for the people in their mindset, in their subconscious, just saying a political party, they don't understand it. So I was talking to somebody on my neighborhood, and he said today, what is this party that you are forming? Is it going to be the party that is going to take power? This is what they think, that the party is a thing like the Communist Party or a one-party system, and I mean that's very important. I think the culture and I think the education of the people is very important towards changing the atmosphere. And this is a very important point, because when you come to a place that has no political life before, you have the potential to change it towards a better system. Don't ruin this opportunity. This is what I'm going to say.
Okay, thank you very much. I will turn back maybe to Anthony, if I may, because we're talking now about the solution, more or less, and how can EU help. You elaborated on this sort of tendency to recycle policies. You elaborate on conditionality, on, for instance, this new initiative to create a European endowment for democracy. So can actually the EU be strategic about its normative ambitions or not? Is it impossible?
Well, it's a challenge, and I think what the EU has tended to do, as is well known, the European Union is not a very flexible organisation, and it's not a very responsive organisation. And I think what it has been shown up in the context of the revolutions is that it needs to have a more fluid political sense of what are the key areas going to be. The traditional model for European grants to civil society is that you decide in Brussels what are going to be the priorities across the world, and then you kind of send out a call for proposals, and then by the time people have completed the paperwork, they already have to be a kind of well-established organization with 5 years of budgets and a tradition and history of being able to fill out enormously complicated forms, and somehow they're missing kind of starting up organizations. So now they're trying to change that with this new thing, the European Endowment for Democracy. And I think that's really important, that they provide funding to organizations based on a much more precise sense of what will take in that particular context, led by reports from the delegations on the ground, what's the most important sector to support at that moment. One of the things that they haven't really done in the past is support political party development. As you said, that's going to be a key thing in Libya. And I think the other thing that I would emphasize, there's really a range of institutional development. I think is going to be key. Independent media is also going to be very important. There's been some recent political science work that looks at kind of new democracies and what's most associated with preventing them from backsliding into authoritarian regimes. And the one factor that's most often correlated with successful new democracies is having a flourishing independent media sector, because that ultimately can really hold their governments to account. So judiciary, independent media, and political party development seem like really important things that the EU should focus on. There is a commitment to do that. I think the question is how much funding there'll be and so on. But in principle, I think they're going to try and support those sectors. And a lot will depend on whether there are partners on the ground who are interested in looking.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to turn to you, Felix, regarding, we have seen that political parties, media, judiciary are key in the transition process. Going back to the discussion on CFSP, you have shown or told us that it was comparatively successful, not such a failure. I wanted to ask you about the role of Germany as well. In the future of this transition, Germany has been portrayed as an outlier in this decision to go to Libya. So what will be the role of Germany in the coming years?
Let me first clarify. I don't think CFSP or the CSDP, as it is now called, being the Common Security and Defense Policy Mechanism, has been a success in reacting to the crisis. I don't think that can be said. I rather contested the view that it was a complete failure. And I in particular contested the view that the sense that Europe failed is a bit too broad and a bit short-sighted. Now, I will stand by my prediction that I think actually CSDP will see a new investment after this, simply because it is seen as necessary now by Europeans. On Germany, I mean, there is a very interesting question here on understanding the German role. I'm not sure I can really predict what Germany will do and what its role will be, but let me answer the question this way. First of all, the portrayal of Germany as the outlier, I think is really interesting that you said it is portrayed as such, because it wasn't an outlier when it abstained from supporting the Security Council resolution. Or it abstained from voting in this session. I think the key point to remember is not only that Germany, agreed basically with a lot of non-European states, namely the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and so forth, who basically also considered this resolution to be problematic simply because it could be interpreted very widely. It is also the case that within Europe itself, a lot of states did not participate and actually quietly were sitting back and taking Germany's position. It is just that they were not in the spotlight. Why were they not in the spotlight? Well, that is because Germany is a very powerful European country and was at that time a member of the Security Council, still is. And so that's why a lot of attention was on Germany. I'm not going into why this abstention happened. I wrote a little blog entry that is posted at Europeanideas back in April on this. All I would say is that from the perspective of the government back then, it looked like an adventure they didn't want to undertake. It looked like an adventure that was similar to the one that they were drawing into Afghanistan, that caused a lot of problems within the Western coalition, and where Germany was repeatedly criticized for not doing enough or not being a good ally and so forth. And given the UK and French eagerness to take the lead, I think Germany was quite happy to sit back and let them do it. Not least because these interventions are very expensive and they come with a lot of strings attached. Also, let's not forget, the financial crisis was already on the horizon back then, and Germany saw that it would need to play a really important role in that. And so I think it just didn't want to have another construction yard that it was supposed to be the main responsible player for. Now, what can Germany do looking forward? And I think there was a lot of attempt in the German government to kind of let people forget that Germany seemingly did not support this military intervention, which again is just abstained. But there was a sense of that Germany was kind of opting out of the Western consensus, and that gave bad press, and the German government was a bit surprised by all the blame that it received, in particular because it actually saw itself in line with the United States. The US position was also very reluctant and very hesitant to intervene, and was heavily lobbied by France and Britain to do so. So the Germans were actually quite surprised of being then portrayed once again, as in the Iraq 2003 case, as the outlier that was kind of not participating in kind of what's supposed to be the mission of the West. Now, because it saw this as an image problem more than anything else, the German government did, behind the scenes but also publicly, support all kinds of other measures, and it was very eager to also participate then in this so-called U4 Libya mission that never materialized, that never happened, because it wanted to show that it doesn't mean they're not interested in supporting the Arab Spring and so forth. However, I think looking forward, what Germany will do, if I may make this prediction, is strengthen precisely what it thinks the European Union is best at, namely civilian cooperation and regime transformation, investment in a region not through military means but through civilian means. And Germany is not last but not least, a country that knows a lot about the region. Not so much. I'm not excusing the fact that I think all Europeans were caught off guard by those transformations. I think, if anything, though Germany kind of, it has a strong tradition and history about studying the Arab world, and I think Germany will push towards a European policy that understands what is going on, that tries to be a productive player. And I think what my two colleagues said already, that tries to play a better role in kind of supporting a transformation that until now in an area it didn't quite understand. And I really think so. That is one of the biggest problems of the Europeans, that they have to radically rethink how they relate to that to that northern African region. They have to understand, rightly as you say, that one cannot use the model of integration or second-degree membership or all these things that they applied in the East. One simply cannot just try to build a Mediterranean Union modeled on the ideal of the European Union. I also think that Germany is very aware that there are a lot of bilateral interests, and that there are still, in particular in the Italian case, talking about Libya, there are colonial histories there that one cannot forget. And let's not forget, Islamophobia still is a big problem in Europe. And Islamophobia is, I think, the one issue that just doesn't go away, and it's one thing that one has to address. And this German emphasis on dialogue and fostering mutual understanding and putting resources into that. It is long term. It is not something that makes a big splash and shows immediate results. But I think that is where you see German investment in, and that's, I think, where you see it will try to push the European Union towards.
Thank you very much. I will now address the final question to the panelists, and then we will open up for questions. And I wanted to close the discussion maybe with a reaction, maybe 2 minutes each, on the regional dimension as well of what we are talking about. In a sense, so for Libya, do you have, there has been, I think, a lot of exchanges as well with the neighbors. You're looking at Tunisia, what is happening in Egypt. Can you maybe elaborate on how this regional dimension is also impacting on the change of Libya? So please, in 2 minutes.
I think when the revolution started in Tunisia, there was a very people were afraid at the time, I think, that Gaddafi will hijack the revolutions there in their beginning in Tunisia. And what happened in Egypt was, I think, a godsend, that it made put pressure more on the regime that was dominating the region, especially that Gaddafi's tentacles was spreading all over Africa, especially in Africa and in North Africa also. The changes that will happen is that I think, that's my prediction, that because of the influence that Gaddafi made in the region, especially in countries like Tunisia, for countries like Egypt, and also with the regime's extension towards like African countries with authoritarian regimes like in Chad and also sub-Saharan African countries, I think we'll see a lot of change in these countries, with lack of resources coming out of Libya, because Gaddafi was fueling most of these conflicts in Africa. Most of these regimes that have been supported financially and also politically by him. When that is, I think, completely gone, I think that will, trigger change also in Africa, and that I think we need to address that for the future. And I think, given that there is a close relation, especially between Tunisia, between Libya, and there is quite a good change that are happening, because now what is happening in Egypt is a bit a second revolution now is coming on, and I think it's still in development. We need to cooperate. I think the European Union also needs to understand that it is much better to address the region through the neighbors. I mean, how I think the Libyans will learn, or how the Egyptians will learn, is from Tunisians, from the integration between each other. And for example, if Tunisians have now a good experience now. Even during the Ben Ali's regime, they had at least a political process that was happening, and they are more or less more politicized than other countries in the region. I think the experience should come from that place and through the European Union, through the help of the European Union, and through the funding of whatever it is. And also, I think investing more in collaboration. I think for the whole region, from North Africa, especially now. I think I'm predicting that lots of other regimes will feel the heat after that is demise.
Thank you very much. And I will turn to both of you actually to react on the regional dimension from an EU perspective. It's an issue that has actually been promoted by the EU to push for South-South, actually regional integration. At the same time, it has also elaborated and played on this idea of Euro-Mediterranean community. So is that still valid nowadays?
Yeah, I think that there are two ways that we could see the influence of what's happening spreading around North Africa. A positive demonstration effect of the sort that you talked about, and a negative contagion effect. And countries in North Africa, although they're delighted with what's happened with Gaddafi, they still look at Libya now with some nervousness. And they look at Libya with nervousness because there are a lot of weapons washing around. And it matters quite a lot whether Libya is established as a secure region where most of the weapons are under control of the government, or it could become a source of instability. Similarly, I think the same thing is true of Egypt now, which just particularly in the last few days, we see a real situation where it could go in the direction of greater polarization and unrest, or it could take another leap forward and, as some people say, have a real revolution that finally curtails the power of the army. So there are two models washing around, and then the third model is Morocco, which could become a model of genuine reform led from above, right? Reform initiated by a sitting regime that really moves towards a kind of relatively genuine, accountable, plural political system, or it could be yet another kind of facade attempt at democratization. But the missing dimension of the North African exchange is the economic dimension. I mean, what's really striking is that there's almost no trade among the different countries of North Africa. And there are various kind of geopolitical reasons why. And Algeria has had its problems with Morocco. Algeria now is looking like the outlier in some ways, and Algeria may have problems with Libya because they were very slow to recognize the new government, the transitional council. But if you look at the figures for trade from the different North African countries, Egypt exports potatoes to Europe, whereas Tunisia imports potatoes from Europe. What doesn't happen is any kind of potatoes being exported from Egypt to Tunisia. It's amazing how little interregional trade there is. And I think for the economic and social development of the region, that's one of the key things is to encourage more regional economic integration.
Would you like to comment on that? I would add to that point also exchange of people, freedom of movement amongst the countries that actually do not know very well each other.
In terms of the regional dynamics, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the so-called Arab Spring is that it shifts the center of attention. And in a way, Europe ceases to be the place where the most exciting things are happening. One can argue whether this was ever the case, but I think European integration is quite an exciting phenomenon. But I actually think that this has shifted now, and you can see this not only in the fact that correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of an attempt to form a Mediterranean Union and turn this Arab Revolution into a European second European integration, or kind of tag onto the European Union or something like that. I also think we shouldn't forget the role of Turkey. And although this seemingly is standing somewhere else geographically in this country, but it actually, I think, as far as I understand, starts to be seen as a model of what some of these countries aspire to, rather than Western European countries and the way they are organized. So I think the European Union has to start realizing that it is not the most interesting player in the region anymore, and that others, and I think Turkey is a good example here, that used to be the kind of countries that saw entering the European Union or being closely affiliated with it as, you know, the overarching goal. That may change, and I think it will change, and I think it already has changed. And I think that is something where Europeans have to kind of rethink themselves, because it means they're actually less interesting and less important maybe than they used to be.
Thank you very much. So we can open the floor for questions. Can you please introduce yourself, and I think we can take a round of 3 questions and then you can answer. Yes?
So I don't know how to introduce, but I'm Peter. I don't know what else you want to do. But I was going to the Turkey thing. I don't know if you know much about this, but how much is actually this kind of you know, how much is Turkey seen as a model state, and how, I mean, you know, Turkey was raised along the media like back in the spring, but now I don't hear anything about them. So I would like to know if any one of you knows how the interaction between Turkey and all this kind of revolutionary states, not only Libya but also Tunisia and Egypt especially, is happening. I mean, what influence does it have?
Well, I'm out for King's College. Just one consideration. It's true that there are some divisions in the European Union, but the UK and France are the most important in terms of military capabilities, in terms of the military expenses in the EU members for in this military action. And that action was carried on while the European Union was preparing the Council of the European Union was preparing Europe and Libya, was waiting just for a start from the UN Security Council. So it's not true that the European was not in action. But in my opinion, if we look at Syria, Egypt, not only Libya, the Mediterranean Sea is falling like domino. So is there, from the European Union, a problems of governance, not how to lead these people having their own self-determination, but how to help them to do so in a context of a difficult democratic transition. We can just say, leave it to the market. Or the European Union is unable to do so because we have division. It's impossible. We have to need for, I'm from Italy, so for me it's a security problem. How to deal with this revolution with a policy, with a common Mediterranean policy.
Hi, Natasha from the Institute in Israel. A question for Gheblawi. How do the people of Libya view any support or interference with UN, like support economically or politically from the EU, especially after the history of close relationships that Britain, Italy, France had with the developing past?
So should we start
Yeah, sure.
with you, or do you?
Okay, let me start with the role of Turkey. I think I think that's one of the interesting features of the region. That although as Felix said, that Turkey one time was aiming for the biggest goal was to join the EU. I think after the government of Erdogan that came in around 8 years ago, I think that was changed now, more integration with, I think, with the past, if you can say, past colonial neighbors also, and they are bolstering more, I think, on terms not just in the economy but also in cultural terms. I think Turkey now is, while in the beginning of the revolutions it came as a sudden surprise for them, especially in Libya, because they had close ties with the Gaddafi regime, and they had basically strong economic ties, and Libya has strong economic interests. They were hesitant at the beginning in trying. I think that is also can be said also about Turkey's role in Syria also now. The Turkish, I think, movement is towards safeguarding the economic, first of all, economic interests that will bring about the change in their what they believe is the Turkish model. The Turkish model is a political model that they think that can be exported to other countries, especially countries that they brand as Islamic countries that have mutual history with them. You can hear now plenty of people, Islamists, in countries like Tunisia, also in Egypt and Libya, saying that the best model for our countries, because we are Islamic countries or Muslim countries, is Turkish model, but in the same time forgetting to mention the party is based on Islamic, ideas. But I think Turkey is basically putting more pressure and taking, I think, a proactive role more than the EU in the region. And in my opinion, I'm not sure that is accepted in all the parties, or at least all the political figures or political parties in the region. Concerning about the role of France and the role of the UK before, when they had a good relationship with the Gaddafi regime, and now the change of the interference with the country. So far, I think lots of people in Libya think that that was more or less, they understand, especially the political figures, that they understand that was a time that required some kind of collaboration. They joke sometimes about why Tony Blair says that he went to Gaddafi in 2004. Why he said that he gave an explanation that if we didn't do that, we won't get Gaddafi out of the cold, we won't rehabilitate him, and eventually we won't have this kind of revolution because we didn't know anything about him. But that's, I think, reading too much into it. I think the main important thing that people in Libya think that there is a moral obligation for, especially France, especially the UK, for intervening in Libya, because they think that because of their relationship, special relationship with Gaddafi, and putting him, bringing him out of the cold and just trying to rehabilitate him, that bolstered the regime's position and also made the regime more had the thought that, or that it started to think that it is more invincible and can stay for a longer time, and had the European, at least some of the European countries covered for continue leading Libya. And when the revolution started, and especially because he bought a lot of arms and military arms and military capabilities from the European Union, some of the European Union countries, and was used against the civilians, I think that was the main thing, that if these countries want to have a good relationship with the new Libya, is to intervene and they get rid of Gaddafi, and that's, I think, what has been done. And at least I think the people think that Europeans, these countries will be important for the future, especially economically and especially in the change that they need to in the future.
So we have direction on, do you want to answer a specific question?
Yeah, I would like to just briefly address this question of helping. Unfortunately, I can't say too much about the image of Turkey in the region now. What I know, you've already elaborated on that, and so I couldn't answer that. I think on the question of the helping approach, whether and how Europe can help now, I think the one problem there is, I think, is that it still sounds rather paternalistic, that all Europe can do now is help. But the one thing that one shouldn't forget, this tension between normative ambitions and security and economic and also identity interests still persists. It isn't like they have gone away. There is still, as I said earlier, there is still Islamophobia in Europe. There is still the big concern with immigration. There is still, as we heard, the issue with opening the agricultural markets. So, Fortress Europe as economic-wise. And there are still also security interests, although the so-called war on terror is now winding down or over. There still is kind of the question, okay, so who are we now collaborating with? And I think there is, from the European perspective, there is a bit of a uneasiness in, of course no one would say so, in seeing all these nice democracies, or so-called democracies, basically very pluralistic places now, where it is far more difficult to deal with, because simply it is very messy, because there are so many voices, there are so many people, there is so much going on, that for Europeans it's very difficult to figure out who are now our partners, who are the ones that are our counterparts, if you want, that we can make deals with and pursue our hard interests with. So I think this tension between supporting civil society and promoting democracy, and yet still not violating or trumping their core interests, security and economic-wise, won't go away. And I think that the Europeans are, of course, normatively supporting democratic transitions, but in terms of making or creating stable relationships with the region, it will be much more difficult for the Europeans. And I think that's actually not something they necessarily think is a good thing.
Yeah, I'd just like to say one thing quickly on Turkey. Essentially, I agree with you. I think that people are looking at Turkey with quite a lot of interest from North Africa. And I think particularly, as you say, the Islamic parties are looking at the AKP in Turkey as an interesting model of how to combine being an Islamic party with functioning within democracy. Although the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, I think, were rather surprised at the speech that Erdogan gave when he came to Cairo and stressed the importance of having a secular state, which was a pretty interesting speech. And I think Turkey's role is interesting. Before they had this policy, which was called zero problems with neighbors, where essentially they took a completely non-judgmental approach to the regimes around them, had good relations with Syria, good relations with Iran, and so on. And what they're, I think, discovering is that in a region that's breaking up, it's very hard to maintain zero problems with neighbors, and you might have to take sides. And they've been a bit slow, but on the whole, kind of been dragged into supporting democracy most of the time, and I think that Erdogan's speech was an important one. But they're not the Islamists aren't the only people who are looking to Turkey. In Egypt, the army, the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, is also looking to Turkey. But they're looking not at Turkey as it is today, they're looking at Turkey circa 1982, when you had a kind of, the initial Turkish constitution post the coup, which essentially had the, very strong role for the army as the guardians of democracy. And if you look at the kind of language that the Egyptian generals are trying to suggest might be written into the Egyptian constitution, appointing the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces as the guardians of constitutional legitimacy, a kind of odd concept of having an unelected group as the safeguard of democracy. That's also an old Turkish model that Turkey itself has discarded and moved away from.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. When you hear the words, you hear Sharia, you hear Islam, you hear Muslim Brotherhood. You only have to see the kind of European leaders show them. And I was just wondering, why is there such a great degree of fear around Islamically related parties, Islamically affiliated parties, that sort of thing?
Other questions? Yeah?
Hello, my name is Nathan, I'm studying at UCL. It's really related to the question you had, is why would Europe be so afraid of Tunisian politicians talking about Sharia and a constitution based on the Sharia?
I wanted to ask about other countries in the region, and there have been talks about why there has been no sign of trying to intervene in Bahrain, in Syria. Well, there are lots of examples. So what do you make of the allegations that interests in Libya were about oil, about preventing mass migration? That goes along with the normative question of normative policy or something like that. Yeah.
So I will turn maybe
what is happening.
Okay, I mean, I think this is a question which has, many dimensions. Some of the reasons that Europeans are afraid of Islamic parties is, because they're, in many cases, these parties have a history of, ambiguous relationship with democracy, and support for political violence in some cases. I think that on the whole, most of the Muslim parties in North Africa have moved away from that. I think they are genuinely supportive of democracy now. But I think it's, the fear stems partly from that. It stems partly from concern about their attitude to human rights and the role of women. And we saw that with the question of, would polygamy be reintroduced in Libya? And these are quite sensitive issues in a lot of European countries. We've seen European countries trying to ban mosques, or trying, there's a whole kind of, I think that it's wrapped up with fears about terrorism, it's wrapped up with fears about immigration and loss of European cultural identity. So, there's a lot going on there, I think. And in some cases it might also be a fear about the kinds of foreign policies that these countries would have, whether they would try and have a very different relationship with Israel. In the case of Egypt, I think some Europeans might be concerned that Islamic-led Egypt would break off the peace treaty with Israel. I think that's more of a concern in the United States. That issue drives a lot of American concern about the rise of Islamic parties. Just on the other countries, I don't really accept the argument that Libya was all about oil. Libya, I think, was driven by the fact that they could do it. It was possible for Libya was, if you look at the sort of the way that the Libyan crisis developed, Colonel Gaddafi turned out to have no friends at all, which made things very easy. And also, Libya's, it's in a way kind of geopolitically quite simple. It's not, if you compare it with Syria, Syria is a deeply divided society with all sorts of sectarian divisions, and the regime has managed to impose a kind of state, a relatively unified state on top of that. And it's in a geopolitical tinderbox. And I think that's driving the fear as well. And in the case of Bahrain, unfortunately, I think it's because partly geopolitical concerns again, and partly, I think, pressure from Saudi Arabia, and partly simply that there are security relationships there. But in Syria, particularly, I think Europeans were very slow to take the Syrian crisis seriously. I think they hoped that Assad would turn out to be the reformer they always wanted him to be, Bashar al-Assad. And I think they didn't recognize the damage that was being done to Europe by taking too long to acknowledge what was taking place. But that period has passed. As of the summer, European leaders are clearly on record that he's lost all his legitimacy, that Bashar can no longer lead Syria and should go. But unfortunately, they have very little influence. And I think for all sorts of reasons, a military option isn't possible. But it's a real dilemma that European leaders are grappling with, is what to do about Syria. So I don't think it's a lack of concern. I think it's a lack of good options.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question, and a very, as Emily said, a very difficult question to answer. Why do Europeans fear Islamic parties? And I think, why is there Islamophobia still in Europe? And it tags onto the question of why did the European Union resist Turkish quest for membership, which I think also comes down in the end to a religious question. And there are just still very long-standing views in Europe that consider Islam just not as part of Europe and consider Europe a Christian state, and tag on that kind of the Huntington rhetoric that the West and Islam are bound in the clash of civilization and so forth. So I think there's a lot of bigger discursive ideological backdrop here and a history that is deeply ingrained in the European consciousness. And on top of that, a debate among Islamic scholars whether Islam and democracy are compatible, and some say yes, some say no. This is again, it's a big issue, and and you pick the kind of scholar that gives you the answer that you want, kind of approach. And of course, then there is the legacy of the war on terror discourse, and in the beginning at least, rather easy conflation of terrorism is equals someone with Islamic faith. But I think in the end there is looking forward, because Europeans are not totally close-minded, but I think there is a lack of understanding. I come back to this point, and I think that it's not only that there needs to be more understanding of the region, it's also that they don't quite know, and no one really quite knows what kind of parties will form. I mean, what kind of governments will we see in those countries where we saw the transitions? I mean, on the one hand, Europe isn't too happy with the military-led government. Yet would they be more happy with the government led by the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, it's not clear to me. So I think there is now a kind of wait-and-see approach, and I think it's a learning approach for Europeans of how to redefine the relationship with its Islamic neighbors. And I think that's not just as neighbors, but also as communities within Europe. So it's an experiment, I think, that Europe embarks on.
Yeah, I think I agree on that point that most of the fear stems from misunderstanding. I think most of it comes from also a tense relationship between, I think, Europe and its neighbors, Islamic neighbors, especially with Turkey, and also I think the historical weight that comes with that. In my opinion, I think what is happening is there is a shift also in Islamic, I think, parties towards recognizing that they need also to change their rhetoric, first of all, and change their manifestos and the policies towards a better, I think, more, I think, civil, and more, I think, even sometimes you can say more secular terms. If you read, for example, the literature of the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood of 36 years ago, I was debating this with a friend of mine who was a former Muslim Brotherhood member, and was talking that if Hassan al-Banna, who was who established the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, if he's still alive, I think he will kill himself when he sees that how the Muslim Brotherhood now has shifted towards, I think, a more understanding of secular, I think, liberal democracy that is coming from, at least from the engagement of not only its neighbors like Europe, but also, I think, from experience inside these countries themselves. The problem is, I think, people have the thought that most of these regimes, the oppressive regimes, totalitarian regimes, are not Islamic. Most of them are either secular, some of them are liberals, some of them they came out from the nationalist movement in the 60s in Egypt, and most of them are not based on Islamic thoughts and ideology. And they also connect these, I think, these regimes, these autocratic regimes, with the European need for security, and that's why these regimes continue to flourish, continue to stay in power, because of that fear of the Islamic movements coming into power. So I think not only the Europeans are changing their tactics toward that, but also I think also the Islamic parties and Islamic movements are changing also, and continuing to change also. I think we'll see a very interesting, I think, experience in Tunisia, where you hear Said Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of the Nahda party, the Islamist party, saying that in a way that Tunisia is a secular state, so we won't put any Islamic articles in the new constitution, and that is, I think, even if it is just rhetorical, that's very, very, I think, important shift, and that will continue. In case I want to talk about why I think I agree with Andrew that why there isn't any intervention in Bahrain or in Syria. I think the same. I think in Libya the pieces of the puzzle came I mean, all together to have a successful, more or less, intervention. You won't have that in other places. The Libyan model is for Libya. I don't think that it can be applied. We can learn a lot from what happened from this intervention, but we can't apply it to other countries, even countries that are close to Libya. I think that was what they can say in strategic terms, that was a Libyan problem with Libyan solution. It's not going to be used in Syria. I think the Syrian problem, I think, will need a lot of work. I think what we learn from these revolutions, that they are unpredictable, and they tend to have their solutions from inside, from within their own problems. I think that is also a complete shift from a strategic point of view in the world.
Do we have time for a last set of questions? Yes? In 5 minutes. So anyone has one burning question before we close that event? Yes.
What do you think will be the future of the cooperation between African states against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, and especially what's going on now in Algeria, and especially because Gaddafi was basically the guy kind of leading the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb?
Well, yeah, I think this card of the Islamic Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, I think that was being used, I think, politically with Gaddafi more than any other place. I mean, Algeria now has been hesitant a lot when it came to supporting the revolution, not only in Libya, also in Tunisia, and also in Libya and Tunisia, and some changes in Morocco. Of course, they have that long animosity with Morocco. But the most important thing is that they have the priority that they need to. Terrorism is a priority in Algeria, and they think that it is very important that we put it on top of the priority before anything else. I don't think that Gaddafi was the guard against the Islamic Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb. He was more or less using that card. Like he used the immigration and migration, and he used it many times. And I think he even said that when he was saying that first of all that these people are not revolutionaries, these are Al-Qaeda, and then he said we might even use Al-Qaeda against this intervention. So I think it was just a card that he was playing, and there is now a genuine, I think, fear. I think there is a genuine also threat that the spread of the arsenal of arms that might trigger a new kind of insurgency in the region. But that is to be seen.